Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, Diligent, PwC, Center for Audit Quality, Spencer Stewart, the Conference Board, and Corporate Board Member, along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, Donnelly Financial Solutions, and the Society for Corporate Governance.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, the CEO of Diligence Boardroom Resources and the co-founder and editor-at-large of Corporate Board Member Magazine, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. Today we're going to be talking about a board's cross-border oversight from FCPA to geopolitical affairs. And joining me is somebody that I can confidently say is an expert in this space. Please welcome Alex Wolff, who's a board member with Albemarle Corporation and Versum Materials. He is also the former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, also served as ambassador to Chile and for a short time France, was the undersecretary for political affairs, worked on Soviet Union affairs, and spent years in the State Department advising businesses and governments. Alex, that is quite the resume.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Well, and it gives you the background for what we're going to talk about. So let's start. I know you serve as chair of the Corporate Governance and Nominating Committee for Versum Materials. And Versum and Albemarle are very international companies. So it creates an interesting challenge, and I know at least Versum already has an international board. So when you're head of the nominating committee, what are the challenges of putting together a board that has representation from various areas across the world?
Well, you start first with the same challenges in recruiting anyone inside the United States, the same sort of professional and personal characteristics. And on top of that, you have additional considerations that aren't typically ones that would involve a search process inside the United States. First, for example, is there a genuine command of the English language, both written and spoken? You may meet someone from another company, another board overseas, but you find out when it comes to actually understanding the material or presenting well, the level of English may not be what you had thought. So that's very important. Does the individual understand the U.S. corporate model? They may feel very comfortable in their local jurisdiction, but the duty of care requirements, duty of loyalty requirements, and the like may be unique to them, and therefore something they must be familiar with. Are they familiar with U.S. regulatory environment, SEC requirements? Again, because most of the decisions a U.S.-based company would make and most of its disclosure and reporting responsibilities fall under American requirements, of course. And another one which many people don't consider is there's actually a greater commitment of time involved when you're overseas. Simple travel tends to be longer. So it usually entails 2, 3, maybe even 4 days additional travel time and commitment to a board meeting. The time differences, if you're doing conference calls, if you're in Asia, for example, and most of the other board members are, let's say, on the East Coast of the United States, much harder to get everyone on the phone at the same time. So those are the general additional requirements when one looks at when recruiting internationally.
Those are a lot of variables, though, that have to be in place. It makes it much more challenging, I'm sure, than the average recruitment.
Indeed. In fact, when you put all of these factors together, it really narrows the field down quite dramatically and quickly.
Yeah. So, again, I was quite taken back, and we had met before, so I knew what your background was relative to all your government work and all your political affairs overseas. That makes you a very interesting candidate for an international board because you get to give input on the geopolitical landscape and intelligence sort of that's out there. And for an international company, that's a big deal for their strategy. Can you sort of give an example of where you've pulled from your past experience or your contacts to help somebody as they're developing their, quote, international strategy?
Well, clearly most companies, to be successful in today's international business environment, need to operate internationally. Hard to think of many that don't have either foreign suppliers or foreign clients or even foreign operations. So this is an increasing area of focus for most companies. And of course, you have to take into account unique risk profiles of each country you intend to operate in. How welcome is U.S. business in that country? How does the local culture complicate or facilitate your business model? Is the country stable politically and economically? Are you going to have problems with wide fluctuations in foreign exchange, in which you usually operate in that country? Very important is the respect for rule of law. Is this a country where you can count on your contract being respected? Safety for your employees, a very important consideration. And what many people ignore, lots of places, there are real costs to both succeeding and to failing. And you have to understand those very well. In some places, if you decide to leave, there may be huge financial penalty and maybe even criminal penalties. And if you're very successful, you draw a lot of attention. Maybe somebody decides to change the tax code or impose a royalty structure. So those are all things that are unique to each country and need to be addressed. We also do, in terms of dealing with foreign governments and in foreign environments, how do you best leverage all the tools and assets that the U.S. government brings to bear that can help a company? Are in sanctions likely down the future? So you need to prepare yourself for that. Are you encountering problems that all American companies are encountering, or is your company encountering a specific problem? So all of those things are unique. They vary country by country, and I think that the broad experience I can bring to bear helps us assess those risks.
Yeah. Well, when we talk about this, China is the perfect example of, will the law hold up? But it's such a massive market that I'm sure people say, okay, what's the risk in us going in? Because the upside, has to be tremendous. So the better that those relations and law works, I'm sure the more comfortable U.S. companies are in making that leap.
No, exactly. I think every time we've considered in any undertaking whether we need to be present in China, all of the downsides appear, but the conclusion always, we can't afford not to be there.
So that's a great segue into my last question for you, and that is U.S. companies, when they go into these countries, sometimes third world countries, sometimes it's a practice in these countries to offer bribes or take bribes or whatever. As you know, the U.S. doesn't look very kindly on people doing those businesses. Companies, if we look back just a couple of years and add it up, it's hundreds of millions of dollars that companies have been fined for FCPA violations in that. Ultimately, that's the board's oversight responsibility. Okay, so you again have the advantage of understanding what's happening on the ground on some of these places, but can you share what you believe or how boards should go about sort of mitigating this risk for themselves, when they're dealing overseas with countries that are known to be in violation of FCPA?
Oh, that's absolutely right. And it's not just FCPA. Most of these countries or regions, like the EU, have their own very strict anti-corruption guidelines that you can easily run afoul of. So it's important to keep a regular eye of an oversight over this. I think generally you need to ensure that your company has a rigorous anti-corruption compliance program tailored to the particular risks you may be facing in any particular jurisdiction. A board, usually through the audit committee, should get regular briefings on the compliance program from the chief compliance officer and from other key individuals in the company involved in these issues. Directors really need to ask a lot of questions around the monitoring and compliance of the controls that are in place. You need a strong training program as well for your employees on what their FCPA obligations are. Good program needs to be well resourced. You also need to insist on audit rights whenever you can, on whatever contracts you're undertaking in another jurisdiction. Be alert and react quickly to any red flags that come up. And most importantly, you really need to ensure that you have the right tone from the top and that your leadership is promoting the right culture and not only worried about what they're accomplishing, but how they accomplish it.
Process is very important in this because it is not unusual to have an employee that goes rogue, okay, in those situations. There's really nothing that a board can do about that. But when they come in to be reviewed, if, as you say, there are expert training program, the board in the minutes has confirmation of the time that they spent on that, that changes the attitude of the Justice Department or whoever it is that's doing that on the effort that was made. I think people understand that something could go rogue. But then the final thing is taking action, the board taking swift action when that happens. Not only is that important from how they're viewed by the outside investigators, but it's also important how the rest of the company views the action the board's going to take if I step out of line.
You're absolutely right. And it's not only employees going rogue. In lots of jurisdictions, you're obliged to have third-party agents. And you may not know what they're doing or how they're going about getting the business. And that's why this transparency, the training that you need to undergo, the questions that your compliance program forces you to ask, and reacting to red flags. And most of these incidents I remember from government investigation side as well. When you reconstruct them or do the forensics on how this came about, usually had signs.
Yeah. Well, Alex, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to join us today. Your insight, based on your experience, is certainly valuable to those viewers watching that are in similar situations. So thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, TK.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take another look at a critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms, brought to you with Knowledge Partners, Diligent, PwC, Center for Audit Quality, Spencer Stewart, the Conference Board, and corporate board member, along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, Donnelly Financial Solutions, and the Society for Corporate Governance.